Can you hear me at this volume? Yeah, so thank you so much, Santiago, Gesa, all the team here at the Rachel Carson Center for inviting me and for the important work you're doing, trying to bridge the worlds of academia and grassroots activism. I will try to contribute some of it myself. I felt the best way to start is with a video that conveys the message a lot better than whatever I can say. So this is a 4-minute video of our first action that actually had Munich at the center during the G7 summit last year that I hope explains quite a bit of the campaign.
And we have found a way that we can connect the workers with the climate and social movements of the world. It's up to us to lead the transition. The IMF and the World Bank, they are keeping our countries in the global south in so much debt that we are forced to keep expanding the fossil fuel industry just to keep up paying the interest on the loans.
The EMF is wielding its power as a creditor to push for further fossil fuel extraction by US and Europe companies.
La Argentina es un caso del cómo el FMI impone un préstamo récord de 44.000 millones de dólares.
Su enriquecimiento particular y de sus empresas a expensa de la destrucción de la naturaleza y de la vida social.
Because of this debt, our country can't take real action for climate. Sri Lankan people deserve decent life. We deserve to live in an environment that is safe for our animals, our biodiversity, and our ecosystem, and our people.
We want to implement a just transition to the development goal. We want to end climate change.
The global north has the largest climate gaps.
Le progrès, la richesse, le développement des pays développés et riches actuellement se fait sur l'exploitation de notre terre-mère y sur l'exploitation y el genocidio de nos pueblos.
Es por todo esto que este es un llamado urgente a todos los trabajadores y movimientos ambientales del norte global a unirnos.
The countries in the G7 have built their wealth on the purposeful underdevelopment of the global south.
G7, we want justice for colonialism. We are tired.
Il est inacceptable que notre population continue à souffrir, continue à payer un lourd tribut à cause des dettes qui ont été contractées par le Belge lors de l'époque coloniale.
One of the richest countries in the world, India became one of the poorest. Between 1765 and 1938, Britain drained a total of $45 trillion.
Por eso la importancia, compañeros, de unirnos en organizaciones con el protagonismo de los trabajadores en esta lucha ambiental de América Latina, de África, de Europa, de Estados Unidos, del sudeste asiático, con un único lema: la deuda es con los pueblos y con la naturaleza.
La deuda es con el pueblo y la naturaleza. Turn debt into climate action.
Turn debt into climate action. Climate justice now.
So I think now I can start the presentation. So since we're a little limited on time and there's a lot of slides, most of them are visual, but I have put references under each slide for anyone that wants to go deeper into any of these topics. I'm going to fly through some of them and I'm going to focus more on certain slides than on others, but Santiago will have a copy of this presentation, so anyone that wants to go to dig deeper can also get it from him and get my contact. You can get my phone number, and I'm happy to answer any further questions you may have. So why we named it Building Global Grassroots Power to Tackle the Climate Crisis from the Bottom Up. We've been trying to find ways to change the system and to change the path in which we are going, which is really self-destructive for humanity. So I'm humbly putting this forth to you today to see if we can brainstorm more ways to get this done and to build power before it's too late, to affect the changes we need before it's too late. So Santiago already explained some of the background of my personal background history, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I come from Vaca Muerta. It's the world's second largest shale gas basin and fourth largest oil basin, shale oil. It's a major geopolitical strategic interest of the United States, who are building a military base on it. And we built a mass movement there by leaking secret documents that the government was hiding. We created a platform called EcoLeaks, and that led to a lot of mobilization, but also a lot of persecution and repression. That's, as Santiago explained, is the reason I'm here. The violations of human rights, displacement of indigenous peoples are paramount, are everywhere in Vaca Muerta, as in much of the global south. And this is one of many reasons we need your support to stop it, and we cannot fight it in isolation. We built a global campaign called Shale Must Fall a few years ago, play on words with Shell Must Fall, which is a movement against Shell, and also, of course, with them and many other comrades from around the world. One of them made this graph just to show the globality of how things are connected. You cannot look at one struggle independently from looking at where the companies are from and where the consumption of, in this case, the LNG is taking place. So a lot of these multinationals are from Europe, including Germany's largest oil and gas company named Wintershall, that most people in Germany don't even know about, but it's a major climate criminal that I would encourage you to research about and try to expose as much as you can. With this Shale Must Fall coalition, as soon as I arrived in Germany, I got involved with Ende Gelände and other movements to help push Ende Gelände from coal into gas, which now is a reality, and into a more internationalist approach. So we mobilized in about 30 countries against fracking, like in this one, or later, last year we mobilized also in global solidarity with the oil spill in Peru by Repsol, a Spanish company. And it's been very exciting building these networks of global solidarity. You feel empowered, but it's not enough. It's not enough to change things, and we're always reacting. We are reactive. Catching up, following from behind after the event happens, after the catastrophe happens, which is something we need to change to jump to the proactive forefront if we want to achieve anything. At the same time, I think we must recognize that top-down solutions are simply not working. So this is a graph that shows the increase in emissions and CO2 over the years as the many climate summits take place. And the course is not changing with this Eurocentric, top-down, governmental level meetings. It's not enough. We need to find ways. We need to think out of the box, because clearly time is running out and things are only getting worse. One of the main reasons for that is that governments are co-opted by the fossil fuel industry, whether or not we like it. The German government, the European governments, especially the global north governments, they have interests that are not the interest of most of the world's population at heart. They are trying to preserve their power, and their campaigns are in many cases sponsored by fossil fuel companies. They lobby their way into policy making. So this is just some of the, COP26 was sponsored by one of the biggest fracking companies, National Grid. That sounds like a state company, but and a few days before the COP was found to be spewing methane all over the UK. Methane is 87 times more potent than CO2 on its global warming potential over 20 years. At the same time as they were launching the Global Methane Pledge, the sponsor of COP was one of the biggest climate criminals. COP27 was sponsored by the world's largest plastic polluter, Coca-Cola, and next COP is presided by the CEO of one of the world's biggest fossil fuel companies. Who can be fooled into thinking that COP is going to deliver any results for the kind of radical changes we need, right? And this is, as I said, a result that power is very imbalanced right now. There is a lot of power concentrated in corporations and financial power around the world, and people are divided. They're not mobilized strongly yet. That's what we're trying to change, so that we can tip the balance. It's all about power. Politicians, you know, we think that it's about the truth, like tell the truth, these demands of the climate movement, the science and all that. All of that is largely on our side, of course. But it's not about the truth. It's politics. It's about power. You know, politicians don't decide usually on truth unless they want to end up like Thomas Sankara, who I will talk about later. It's about power. So we need to build power to change that balance. And this is something where academics, the academia can play a major role, but especially if they understand that you should be providing the grassroots with the elements that they need to build that power, the science, the numbers, the legitimization of the campaigning, but we need to work together. That's why I think what you're doing here is so important. I'm grateful that you invited me. At the same time, the climate movement is at a crossroads. You know, while we demand fight for 1.5, system change, no climate change, tell the truth, the bankers and the corporations are just draining the planet of the last drop of oil and gas and profit that they can, and they will continue to do so until we can impose enough power to change that, to force politicians' hands to govern for our side, not as much to their side. Part of the reason of the climate crisis, and what I call here the elephant in the room, that has not been until recently really in the debate, and in my opinion is still far from being at the center of the discussions, is colonialism. Colonialism, the IPCC in last year's report acknowledged finally that colonialism is at the root of the climate crisis. As I said earlier, all of these slides have the references below that you can later research more on. I don't need to explain to you the role of Europe in colonialism and the human rights violation that this have entailed for 500 years, together with the Eurocentrism that this has built. And this is something that maybe in Europe is not easy to see as much, but the Eurocentrism of Europe is really strong. And this translates also in the climate movement, and that's something we need to change, because this is a global fight, and we must think globally. It doesn't work if we're thinking in our bubbles. So, needless to say, these are the countries that have been colonized by Europe, most of the world. There has been a drain from the Global South. These are data mostly from Jason Hickel and his work, who's also supporting the campaign. We did a workshop with him a few months ago that you can find on YouTube, a panel. And so you can see just some of the numbers, and this is only from 1960, okay? It's not from 500 years. The drain of wealth from the Global South to the Global North. This all amounts to the climate debt, the fact that the Global North has produced more than excess of 92% of excess emissions that have led to the climate crisis, and the Global South barely 8%. While at the same time, the Global South is the most vulnerable to the consequences of the climate crisis. So the injustice is staggering, but I'm not here only to appeal to your solidarity and responsibility. I'm here because this also means your own survival, not only because of billions of refugees that are going to come here, and fascism is already growing, so you can imagine what that means for Europe, but also because the climate crisis sooner or later will affect everyone, except the ultra-rich that are going to move to the poles maybe and build a climate apartheid that is already happening. So this is also a calculation from Hickel on the wealth and the atmospheric appropriation from the Global North countries and how much they should be paying to the Global South because they're exceeding of their fair shares of CO2 emissions. And I'm sorry that I'm flying through them. I also want to leave some room for questions, so we can always go back to this. At the same time, our countries in the Global South are truly at the front lines of the climate crisis. The killing of environmental defenders, you know, my case that Santiago was telling you about is just a minor little example that doesn't even compare to the massacres that are happening of environmental defenders, and Latin America has the 70% of the murder cases between this period until 2017. 17% of the 1,558 environmental defenders murdered were in Latin America. So these are the people that we need to help, and we need to visibilize, and we need to connect with the people in Europe to try to build international solidarity, so at least they cannot be murdered so easily if there's global repercussions. That's what we have been trying to do in the last few years in building these networks of international solidarity. At the same time, the indigenous people of the world amount for only 5% of the world's population, yet they take care of 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. The biodiversity upon which all of us survive. So it's not a matter only of solidarity. As I said, your very survival depends on helping them survive and protecting them, far from what is happening today. So I said that colonialism was the elephant in the room of the climate crisis, and until recently, that was not really in the agenda of the climate movement, such as colonialism has not really been in the agenda, even though in the last few years, movements have become, trying to decolonize themselves and work more with the global south. There is still a long way to go, and as I said, the Eurocentric tendencies sometimes permeate even in the climate movement, and it's really hard to change those structures. So there is no way for the global south to have any chance at having an energy transition while we are drowning in debt, and debt is a tool of colonialism, as you probably the video explained better than I can say anything else about. But the debt of the global south is growing a lot, and is predicted to grow even more. Already there's a lot of countries, this is in the order of trillions of dollars, and already more than 54 countries of the global south are living in a debt crisis, and as this says, this is up from 31 countries in 2018 and 22 in 2015. So as you can see, this is increasing. My country is one of them. We were awarded the biggest loan in the history of the IMF, totally illegal, illegitimate, breaking their own statute to help right-wing President Macri win the re-election, which even with that money he lost, but that money was, it flew the country as soon as it came in through financial schemes, and now Argentina is in a huge debt crisis without any dollars to come up for this, and the way they're facing this is more extractivism, more fracking in Vaca Muerta, deforestation in the northwest, lithium in the northeast with repression and changing the constitution to ban social mobilizations, offshore drilling in the coastlines, and soybean production from Monsanto, and so on and so forth. It's just one example of what's going on as a common denominator in the global south. So basically, that is just the modern day way to continue the plundering of resources from poor countries to the industrialized West. As you see here, also poor countries spend more than 5 times on paying their debt, which also has huge interest, right? Debt is a nice business for the rich countries because they can borrow at almost 0% interest, but for the global south, just the interest alone makes it impossible to ever pay this back. And also they have already paid back this debt many times over in many cases, just on the interest that they have been paying. This in turn gives the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the Paris Club, and others a lot of power politically to strangle our countries and force austerity policies that affect the workers and indigenous people and vulnerable communities more than anyone. These are just some examples of the debt hitting really different countries like Sri Lanka, Ghana defaulting on their debt, Argentina defaulting again a couple of years ago, Zambia, and Nigeria's cost of servicing their debt this year has exceeded their national revenue. Can anybody tell me how is Nigeria supposed to take any climate action? Of course, they commit to the Paris Agreement and all that, but it's just words. There's no way in reality. And at the same time, many of these leaders are not willing or ready or brave enough to confront the debt. As I will tell you later, you will see why. Pakistan. Pakistan is a great example of a recent catastrophe from the climate crisis to which they have contributed the least, as you can see in this graph to the right, at the same time as they are drowning in debt and they have no way to face repairing and reconstructing their country, and even less mitigating climate change. The IPCC has also been clear on that, so I'm going to show you that this is not just some crazy idea that a couple of us are thinking about. There's a lot of institutions and leaders, world leaders, who are talking about it, so the time is becoming more and more ripe for these ideas that we need to cancel the debt of the Global South just so we can have any chance at having a just transition, such as the IPCC has recognized that addressing the debt, unsustainable debts, must be addressed and cancelled so that they can afford to take climate action. The UN Secretary General has been all over the place demanding the same thing, calling for debt relief for Pakistan and for the Global South, and an urgent change for the financial system of the world to address the debt crisis. This is an international panel on food systems, which is also addressing the food crisis and how it's connected to the debt crisis, because we cannot feed our own people while we are just sending all of this money abroad and extracting resources with no added value just to ship them abroad as well, and then to import all this elaborate technology from the global north. Faith leaders as well. You know, bishops have called for the G7 recently to cancel the debt of the Global South. The Pope, in many cases, has done the same. And there is a long tradition in the church itself to call for debt cancellation. It's called the Jubilee. It's as old as the Bible. And 20 years ago, Jubilee 2000 was a big international movement to cancel the debt of the Global South. I will talk about it a little more later. Even here, the Munich Security Conference, worldwide known, they have recognized in the last meeting this year the threat to global stability that debt means. And the German foreign minister even has recognized that the current international finance architecture of the Bretton Woods system cannot adequately respond to the crisis, and we need some changes to that. Also, I'm going to talk more about that later because we happen to have some ideas for system change. You know, like we talk about a lot about system change, but we need to get concrete and get real on how we can get to that. So in a nutshell, there's many paths like this. All of these things should be addressed. There's debt cancellation that I'm focusing on, but of course reparations are owed for colonialism and enslavement of much of the world. Loss and damage that I'm sure you all know about already. But it's not enough what has been committed to, and it's not even being funded, and in many cases it's even in the form of more debt. Just as climate finance, it cannot be given as forms of more debt with interest. It should be given as interest-free funds for these countries to afford an energy transition. So in this process of trying to stop being reactive and trying to get ahead to think proactively, in this process of trying to find bottom-up solutions and approaches, because as you saw earlier, the top-down solutions are simply not working, and the institutions that are in charge of leading us in the right direction are co-opted by the people whose interests are on the other side of in the opposite direction of keeping the fossil fuel industry running as long as they can. We need to find and think strategically and find common denominators that can speak clearly and loudly to as many groups as possible, because what we need to build the necessary power that is required is to bring together enough forces. And you'll never bring together enough forces if you're just preaching to the choir. You know, we're in our leftist bubble and we preach to the choir who already agrees with us. Or we are in the activist environmental bubble and we preach to the choir. And it sounds great that we have great ideas and great solutions, but they never get anywhere without the power of other movements such as the labor unions, the workers that we need to connect with. So Debt for Climate is definitely not going to be the only common denominator, but it's a formidable one that we found to take a first step in that direction. At a very grassroots level, it has enabled us to connect with worker unions, feminists, indigenous movements, even faith leaders. The G77 that I will talk about is the coalition of non-aligned countries, the Global South countries that are most affected and least responsible for the climate crisis, and of course climate movements. So it's a common denominator that speaks very clearly to the interests, not only to the ideals, because in this you have ideals such as we do, but there's also interest. And unless we can speak to the interests of enough groups in society that have the power to change things, we are only going to remain as a testimonial declaration of preaching to the choir. Since this is a survival fight, we must get serious and we must get ready to make the changes that we need and speak to the people that even we might not agree with, that might have the capacity to build a broad enough coalition, which is going to have contradictions. That's the difficulty of building coalitions. You speak to the people you love, you like already, you feel great. But it's when you speak to those that don't agree with you and don't have the same culture or ideology that it gets difficult. But that's the art of politics. This is a political challenge. So we need not partisan, but political challenge. So we must learn strategy and how politics works, which is an art, not a technique or a science alone. So that's what Debt for Climate is trying to do. And so far we've been growing a lot. We're already present in more than 32 countries and gaining a lot of momentum. We are inspired by the legacy of Thomas Sankara that I mentioned earlier. He was a revolutionary leader from Burkina Faso who was assassinated 35 years, this year's going to be 36 years ago, October 15th, for calling to build a global front, a united front against debt from the global south, in order that these countries could have enough power to confront these international institutions that are so much more powerful than any given country of the global south. Because he was left alone, he was murdered. He even foresaw that in his speech when he said this. He said, if we don't do this, I will not make it to the next African meeting the following year, and he didn't. That's why other leaders, I said earlier, are not brave enough, or they don't foresee that this is even possible. Our job as a social and climate movement is to make it possible, is to broaden the spectrum of what politicians could do and put enough pressure from within so that they could actually negotiate and conceive. If you cannot dream it, you will never do it. So we must have a vision, we must be visionaries, and also dream of what can be done and expand the possibilities. So in thinking strategically, there's pillars of power, the military, the universities, like this center as well, government, business, religion, so these are the pillars that keep the system running. We need to find ways to influence, and this is not all of them, and they change as well, but we need to find ways to influence and break down these pillars to get some of this on our side so that we can make the necessary changes that are urgently needed. So as I showed you earlier, Debt for Climate is a common denominator to many movements. Needless to say, the environmental of climate movements, because of the destruction at an environmental level by the mega mining and the floods and the fracking operations and the destruction of the Amazon with oil spills, deforestation and so on. So to these people, it's pretty clear that we need to take action to stop this, especially the frontliners that are they're called sacrifice populations. Corporations are turning much of the global south into sacrifice zones, even to finance and to provide materials for the transition in Europe. The lithium that is extracted, now in Argentina there's a huge crisis because of the repression, and they're changing the constitution in the lithium reserves areas to make it illegal to demonstrate, to displace indigenous populations. So this is only getting worse unless we can get serious on how to stop all of this. As I said earlier, it speaks to the workers. That speaks to the workers very clearly, and this is something really important. I am really worried in Europe to see how the workers and the climate movement are getting antagonized. If we allow this pattern to continue, might as well hang the gloves and go home. Because if you lose the workers and the fascists that are coming are going to play us against one another, the fight is lost. On the other hand, if we can find ways to speak to the workers for them to become protagonists before it's too late, instead of antagonists of the climate fight, that's the way to go. So one way to speak to the workers of Europe, it may be to say, well, campaigns like this one is not targeting you and your livelihood. We are targeting the same people that are exploiting you here, the Davos elites, the 1%, are the same people that are exploiting us in the global south, so we can connect to hold them accountable for their climate debt and so on. So these are some of the, for debt in the global south, you talk to them about the climate and it's like here, it's not quite high on their agenda, but you talk to them about debt and that's a very urgent and pressing issue that is affecting their life and their livelihood. So the austerity policies, which mean cuts and privatization of social services, of water, job loss, inflation. Argentina has just surpassed 100% inflation this year because of this debt. and the cuts in social services, the pensions, and so forth. The same is true for feminist movements. There's many feminist movements like Argentina's Ni Una Menos that we're working with. We just met with their leaders in Berlin. They're here for a few days. And they are leading the way on demanding debt cancellation, explaining how debt disproportionately affects not only the workers but the women. Like in Argentina, the IMF demanding that they cut the pensions for women who did housework for all of their life, and they could not contribute to the pension system. Then they were given a retirement plan, and the IMF demanded that this be cut, so that they have to depend on the salaries of the men and fall farther into precarity and poverty. Indigenous movements, needless to say, they were the victims of the original theft and plunder, from which all of the wealth that they are lending us back with interest was stolen from them. So they're being the victims of displacement and land grab, and as I said, they are the ones protecting most of the world's biodiversity, so they should be supported and not destroyed. Needless to say, the environmental destruction, and they are at the forefront of death, criminalization, and persecution. Now on the faith side, I mentioned the Jubilee and I mentioned the church because they have played a major role. You know, the church, whether or not we like it, it's also had a major role in setting the standard, the mainstream discourse. The Jubilee 2000 played a major role to help debt cancellation become a topic of the discussion and to achieve some of its goals. And next 2025 is going to be the next Jubilee year, so I'm going to tell you more about that later. Jubilee South and the Jubilee 2000 coalition were some of the movements that preceded us 23 years ago, but of course they were not connecting with climate, which is something that we're doing now, which we believe is the disruptive element, because it also speaks to the interests of the global north and the survival at a planetary level, not only appealing to their solidarity and goodwill as an act of debt forgiveness. This is an act of debt cancellation, it's an act of justice. So, last March we were with the Pope at the Vatican, and he gave us his blessing, you know? So he invited us to the Vatican, and he gave a blessing to Debt for Climate. This has a history as well that I'm not gonna go too deeply into, but he supported our fight against fracking. This is our comrade Juan Pablo, co-founder of Debt for Climate as well, who got this picture and helped, this was about 10 years ago, and helped position the church against fracking, which for us in Mendoza, in Vaca Muerta, was a very powerful tool, as most of the people are very, very religious, and we put the government in a really difficult position with that support. So there's a lot to discuss about that, but this is also part of the broadness of the coalition I'm telling you about. And we are very much a global south perspective, and this is something that maybe in the global north is a little difficult to understand or it's difficult to accept because of, in part, the Eurocentricity I was telling you about. Also here there is very clear black and white, left and right ideological boundaries, whereas in the global south, in many cases religion has played a horrible role, but also religion has played a role in emancipatory movements. Theology of liberation, the Jesuits that Santiago was telling me about in Colombia, in South Africa against apartheid. One of the co-founders of Debt for Climate is from South Africa, is a historic fighter against apartheid, and always brings this up as well. And as I showed you the map earlier of the climate, you know, the 92% of emissions of the global north and the most affected countries, as you can see, this is pretty much the whole global south. And the global south has come together in the group of the 77 countries. Now there are 134, but it's still called the G77. This is important because of what follows. We are not trying to reinvent the wheel. When you talk about system change, we want to anchor this in the traditions and in the history of what the global south has already worked on and come together to push for. This is very little known, but 49 years ago, next year is going to be 50 years, the new international economic order was proposed by the G77. This was a radical change to the global economic system and an order of things in the world that was largely lost and is unknown in the global north, but there clearly was a publication and a statement against colonialism for controlling the multinational companies, restructuring the international monetary system, radical change to the rules of international trade, and to respect the sovereignty of nations of the Global South over their natural resources. So this is something that we are working with, and this is why now one of our comrades is in Cuba meeting with them right now this week. Cuba has the presidency of the G77 this year, and we're working to, as much as we're working from a bottom-up Global South grassroots level, to influence and work with the G77 so that we can revive this and have it, this 21st century version that includes debt and includes climate crisis, so that we can come together from both ends with your support in the centers of power. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, and there's a clear path to system change. And if you want to know how good a proposal is, just look at who opposes it. Ta-da! All the Western powers have systematically opposed. This is from 2022, actually. There was a new vote to reactivate the new international economic order. Of course, all of the global north and the powerful Western countries are opposing it from day one. So there you have a clear direction in which you need to go, where we can start making some changes, because change is not from one to nothing, from nothing to all. It's a progress, it's a process that we need to find steps that empower people to make more and more changes. So this is definitely the way we have found to push in that direction. Here's Juan Pablo. This is from yesterday. So he's in Cuba right now, and this is Che Guevara's widow and Che Guevara's daughter. They have given us their support, and he's meeting right now with other leaders and ministries of environment in Cuba that, as I said, this year has the presidency of the G77, and this week there is a convention on climate and environment. So it's very exciting to work with all of these people. And once again, to go back to the idea of the Jubilee, we also have a very clear strategic vision, which is to build a broad convergence of power towards 2025. 2025 is a very strategic year for two main reasons. The Jubilee will happen again. It doesn't happen every year. It happens now every 25 years. It will set the tone, and it will set the mainstream discussion again about debt cancellation at a time when the debt crisis we're already seeing is expected to be already much worse, and needless to say, the climate crisis as well, especially for our countries. And the other main reason is that COP, as I said, as bad as I said that COP is, we must not just deny it. We must find ways to take it back to represent the people. And this is a great opportunity because Lula's proposal has been accepted, and COP30 will happen in the Amazon. So we are working to build a broad convergence of forces globally and specifically in Latin America, so that we can put debt cancellation at the top of the political and climate agenda, not only of COP, but of the entire discourse of this year, and build by then, as we're already doing, a broader and broader coalition of labor unions, indigenous movements, and many, many others to put pressure and build real power to tilt the balance of power that I showed you earlier is so out of balance. Now, there's also this debt, but before I would like to say one more thing. The Amazon is a great example. It's a quite unique situation. It's a global south anti-extractivist struggle, deforestation and so on, but at the same time, it touches a deep nerve in the global north because it has a major global climate impact, as it's known as the lungs of the world. In Munich, we could talk to anyone in the streets and they know the Amazon. So it's not the same with Vaca Muerta or the Okavango or many of our other struggles. So if there is a place where we think we can make the breakthrough, it's going to be on the Amazon. The debt cancellation to enable the protection of the Amazon. That's where we think all of these are strategic elements that we're working for and building the power towards that. Now, one thing I just wanted to share with you, and I'm not going to read all of this, but there's a greenwashing program by the World Bank and the IMF that is called Debt for Nature Swaps or Debt for Climate Swaps that I just wanted to leave you here with. And again, there is references under this presentation that you can look at. But basically, they remove the sovereignty from the countries. The amount of debt that is swapped is a small amount, is insignificant compared to the real amounts. And usually it means giving it to a private NGO like WWF, that I don't know if you know in how many human rights violations they are involved. And so it's very problematic. Petro from Colombia is pushing for this, but at least he's talking about debt. What I was discussing with Santiago from Colombia earlier, that Petro's not doing what he wants, he does what he can. At the very least, he's one of the few leaders in the world that is questioning the debt. We must build the pressure from the bottom up so that Petro can have a broader spectrum of action and actually demand debt cancellation for a sovereign, self-determined, just transition where the indigenous peoples, the labor unions and so on, have a voice on where that money needs to be invested. Oh. Yeah, so I wanted to invite you to join us. Our next big action is going to be in October. It's the annual meeting of the World Bank and the IMF in Marrakesh, Morocco. So we're going to organize a counter summit there in case you want to come, but also global mobilizations, and you would help us a lot by tackling financial ministries of Germany, of Europe, World Bank offices, or even demonstrations or symbolic things online. Germany has the 4th largest voting power in the International Monetary Fund. It's the 4th largest polluter globally, historically, and it owes its own prosperity and economic miracle to the cancellation of their own debt after World War II, and given extraordinary conditions to pay the rest of the debt that was not cancelled with their own currency and things we could never dream of. So you would help us a lot, because it's also the leading economy of Germany, and people tend to take on what comes from Germany, from the climate movement and so on. Here's all the contact information that you're going to get from the PDF from Santiago. And sorry that I ran very fast through this, but at least now we could have about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you.